Hey, it's Brad. So, I've talked about serendipity multiple times, and not to beat a dead horse, but I feel like, it's easy to phrase it as God making puns. It's my favorite way to look at it. So I had just gotten a conversation from my wife about how I need to take care of myself. And then during the day, heard in passing people talking about, you really need to take care of yourself so you don't get sick. And then people talking about getting sick after that. And then come home, sit down, resume a video I was watching of a Joe Rogan interview. And I resume it. Not 30 seconds into it, he starts saying, yeah, you really need to take care of yourself because you get up and all this stuff and you start getting sick a lot. Talking about the guy who was interviewing having his heart rate high or something like that. But taking care of yourself, generally the stigma and why, it's a virtue to work yourself to death. That's, a holdover from where productivity determined human value. When you could only work harder and you couldn't really work smarter. And if you could, that wasn't your issue. Aside from, modern slavery, that's another soapbox for another time. But Joe Rogan, if you've never heard of him, that's pretty much impossible. But he's a comedian, MMA commentator, expert, and all around awesome dude. But he interviews people on a podcast that he then does on YouTube. And his comedy gives him insight into, the patterns of things and allows him to take the objective truth of something and then work it through his, expert craft. But the podcast, he talks about all sorts of random stuff. We have very similar styles of conversation in thought, I guess. But one of the things that I was talking about the other night about how you can't control your legacy. You have no say over what people say about you in light of things you have no control over. And especially once you're gone, there's not a whole lot of ways you can control anything. But really, the more honest you are with yourself, there's very little about your own life you control at all. But in general, you just need to take care of your hubris. Again, another rant about, I feel like every sin, everything that people, the 7 deadly sins and all these other variants, they're all forms of hubris, feeling like you're entitled to something. And it's almost a running gag among my friends that I, once a week will say that we're all equally worthless. And it's that kind of Socratic authenticity that Joe Rogan uses. And he's not just a pushover. He's not just, a blank slate waiting to extract whatever the other person's talking at him. It's like when something comes up and there's a point that he feels needs to be made, he'll make the point. Cites references, and he's authentically curious. And just the fact that he's willing to have an open conversation and listen to the other person's side, no matter what it is, that's impressive enough. I mean, that's, him, Jordan Peterson, all these guys that are, what's it called, intellectual dark web, been smeared by other groups for various reasons. Generally, it's undeserved. And again, that authenticity, that seeking actual truth is what gets proven out. What has, I used a term yesterday, perpetual into eternal value, and that's what determines its innate value. So that approach is, that authenticity is proven out. Like, I try to be authentic. Part of how I hold myself to that is by keeping these videos, like I tag each one of them as intentionally unrefined. Because I don't know what I'm going to talk about 10 minutes before the video. But then I'll sit down and think, okay, well, what comes to mind here? Just some random thing pops in. Jot down a note on a note card. Ramble about it for a second. And use those as just reminders, talking points, so I don't go too far afield. But yeah, it's like the song Only the Good Die Young. I like that song. I like Billy Joel. Obviously, it's not my core music, especially anybody who knows me, but it's so prolific in its own right, and in the time since it's been, written and released, all the various contexts that it's been referenced, all the aspects of modern culture it's influenced, it is its own meme, its own concept, its own living semantic entity, I guess. And it makes me wonder, like, maybe the phrase, only the young die good, that makes sense as being the original phrase that was a pun of. I don't know. I've never heard that phrase. Makes sense to be some, like, very Puritan style saying that would be something people would say in the 40s and 50s, back when productivity determined a person's value and everyone was evil. It's a very Catholic time. But again, I don't know for sure, and I've never even looked it up. Were we to have any conversation about it, it'd be the first thing I do. Another thing I'm kind of notorious for is Googling everything. And that's where I feel like the distinction, and where I like to be precise with my language, is important. Of, like, if I say that, I'll say maybe it was a parody of this phrase, and maybe that was a phrase they said. I would never state that as a fact unless I was saying, in a fiction setting or in a theory where, if this is the case, then that, I try to make it where the logical flow of my words can't misconstrue their meaning. And like this interview, part of why I write things down, because I can't remember names very well. Joe Rogan was talking with Ian Edwards, which Joe Rogan is one of my probably top 5 comedians. Just his style, the way he approaches the concept, the way he parses them. And then his, word economy is great. But he said that this guy's the funniest man that he's ever known. So immediately got to look into that. And he mentioned on the podcast, the comedian mentioned on the podcast, Ian mentioned on the podcast that people come up to him all the time and say, Joe Rogan mentioned you. Well, that's how prolific Joe Rogan is, because he's so authentic. And just being a good guy, now where the truth is available, will out.